exploring fear, faith, and stories that scare the hell out of us. Be afraid.
First off, thank you for joining us, and for spending time, especially because of the writer's strike. I think I'll ask you some writing questions, because of the possible, people that watch movies. I'm often unaware of whether or not they know how important the writing is for what ends up being credited to directors and producers, etc. But before we get there, I like to start with softball questions. So if you don't mind sharing, what's the earliest memory you have of being afraid?
Probably you would think that I would have, in all these movies I've written, I would have sort of taken the time to reflect and deep dive on my own past trauma. I do remember, irony of ironies, and I don't think I've told anyone this story, but when I think I was 7 years old, and my Aunt Tish, my mom's baby sister, who was she's so fun and crazy, and she was the youngest sister, so she was, not that much older than the oldest grandchild, and I'm from Georgia, we have our kids young, you know what I mean. And so my Aunt Tish would have all the grandkids, or her nieces and nephews, not our grandkids, sorry, the nieces and nephews, over at the house a lot, and she would show us movies and things. And I'm like the fourth, niece or nephew, and so I was 7, maybe 8 years old, and my older brother was 13, 14, and my Aunt Tish had us all over. There's 5 of us, ages 14, 13, 10, 8, 7.
All siblings, or are these cousins too?
Oh, cousins.
Okay, cousins.
And she showed us The Exorcist. True story. And and then down in her basement, we all lived in the same neighborhood, which was really cool. Growing up, I lived 2 streets over from all my cousins, and on my mom's side. And in my aunt's basement, she was at the bottom of the cul-de-sac off this hill that led down to a creek. And she had this 3-story house, and in the basement was unfinished. And for some reason, when they were making the basement and they were laying the cement floor in, they had all this excess cement. And some unwise builder poured a big pile of cement in the corner of her accident. One of the workers fell from the top when they were framing the house and fell to his death on the cement floor. And they didn't want anyone to know, so they just poured cement over his body. And that there was this dead construction worker in the basement of her house. And when you're 7, 8 years old, that'll scare you. And so that was always this, when I went over to her house, it's always this, I would never go in the basement because I was always afraid of the cement pile in the corner. And then one night she shows us The Exorcist. And of course, I'm scared to death, so I run into the other room and I'm by myself, and one by one the cousins were fleeing the scene of the crime, and but then I was right over the top of where in the basement the cement pile was, and that was an unpleasant evening, I can promise you. I think I probably ran home to my house, which was up the street, and crawled into bed and pulled the covers over my head. But I think that's the earliest I have a visceral memory of being afraid.
Well, that's great because it's also connected to a movie.
I
often try to, that's usually my follow-up, of then what's the earliest of being a movie? And a lot of times they are the same. And it's been recurring that it has to do often with a collection of cousins and a too young person.
Really?
That's watching a horror movie.
How interesting.
Yeah, that's great.
The collective experience of being scared. I mean, I think it's something that you're drawn to. I used to watch when I was in middle school and high school. We'd have sleepovers and we'd watch. There was this, channel. I grew up in Atlanta, and there was like Channel 36, which on Saturday mornings would have these scary movie marathons. Maybe it was just October, because I remember doing it during football season. So it's probably October, during the month of October, they have these marathons, and I'd watch. So I'd go to my friend Tim's house and spend the night, and then sit up all day Saturday and watch these scary movies. But I think it was the act of watching them together collectively, that shared experience, whether you're in the movie theater or whether you're in someone's house. It's like comedy, like it's something more powerful about the experience when you're sharing it, and and I think that goes specifically for genre films and more so maybe even than your average drama. Just being scared or laughing, it's just more contagious when it's a chorus of it happening around you, and it's more powerful, and it makes that experience more special, I think, and certainly being scared is one of those experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. We thought about, because there's the odd sort of comedy horror that you think like, well, how does that go together?
Right.
But if laughing and jumping are both like reflexive things that you can't actually help if the filmmaker does it right, those are pretty similar as opposed to a brooding drama that's having to make you think or whatever. And then it's no small wonder that, and maybe Blumhouse is one of the reasons that like post-COVID theaters came back. All the dramas in the world aren't going to get you to go watch it in the theater, but it's all these horror movies.
Horror's had a real boon. I mean, it's been happening for a long time and many years, but even post-COVID, and a lot of the movies that people are going to are horror movies, and there's definitely something to that, and that's why Jason Blum's been able to create, and not just him, but specifically him, create such build such a huge company that is doing a lot of really good work and scaring a lot of people. I think people want to have that experience, and there's a safety in being able to be scared and in the with other people and the safety of other people, and there's something about that that's really, I think, attractive.
Huh. See, I hadn't thought about that. So you're suggesting it's not even just I'm going to be afraid or to like deal with fears. It's I'm going to kind of experience safety.
To me, I think the three scariest movies I've ever seen, I did not see them in a theater. I didn't have those experiences, and I really wish and I'm waiting for them to kind of come back in a rep theater or something and go see it at the New Beverly or something. And I haven't had that experience, and I crave it because I think it will magnify that experience, I guess. There's something about the energy of a crowd that amplifies a scare, not just a jump scare, because the films that are, I think the scariest films aren't really jump scare based movies, or they don't employ jump scares as their sort of primary tactic. It's more films that create a sense of dread, a sense of unease, an unsettling of one's soul. And by myself watching these films, there's some equation that's just missing. Some again, it's like shared experience. It's human connection. It is. Maybe it's because I'm theorizing here. Maybe it's because I don't want to be scared just for the sake of being scared. I want to be scared in order to sort of experience a part of the human condition. I mean, I believe that, it's what's great about drama is that it allows you to vicariously experience the whole swath of human emotions, the darkest of which, if we're fortunate enough, we don't ever have to experience in real life. But to be able to experience those creates empathy because we understand others' experience, and to do that with others then just amplifies the reality that other people experience this thing, this depth of fear or terror or despair or whatever, or this high of joy or ecstasy, whatever is the parameters of those emotions. To recognize other people experience these things too, and to see other people literally experiencing them. I just think it's part of what creates empathy. It builds empathy, compassion as a human being, and that's what's powerful about drama to me.
So as you're thinking, because you've done both. So the Quarry is one that I really like. Rectify, I think I've told you that. One of the best TV shows, especially especially depicting a person of Christian faith in like a non-cynical but authentic way. But then a few years ago, you got into Halloween Kills, Firestarter, Insidious, and then upcoming Exorcist. So as you're seeing projects come across your desk or you're pursuing them, are you more drawn to like to the genre or the story? And like you get the story and go, well, that requires this sort of genre, or you go like, ooh, I like to tell scary stories, and that one will work, or maybe it's both.
It's a good question. For years and years, I thought all I wanted to tell were small Southern stories, dramas. That was my passion. Flannery O'Connor is my hero, and I just wanted to to reflect the experiences of being a person from the South. I wanted to share those experiences with other people. I wanted to tell authentic Southern stories, for which I felt there was and still is a lack of. And that's all I really wanted to do. I didn't think the other genre was really worthy of my attention. And it sounds terrible, but that's really my naivete. I was like a young high school, college film aspiring filmmaker.
And a fan of O'Connor, who's sort of writing Southern horror. Really.
She is writing Southern horror, but I didn't see it as that initially. Although I love genre movies, I just never thought. I realize now I kind of looked down upon them. I didn't think they really had. They were more for surface level thrills and laughs and scares or whatever. But I didn't find they were providing much depth in my life. And I guess the stories that I resonated most with were dramas at that point, or brooding European cinema, or whatever I was into as a snotty 19-year-old or whatever. But the older I got, and actually it was through our mutual friend Scott Derrickson, who sort of began to change my opinion on the value of genre and horror specifically. I just began to look at it differently, and I began to recognize an opportunity to really tell stories of real depth and meaning, to talk about spiritual things, to talk about real things, to talk about evil, and in both a specific and an abstract way, and however you define that. And through genre, which gives you a motor, a propulsion, an engine through which to actually pull a viewer in. When I was a young writer, filmmaker, I just was like, all I care about, I don't care about the audience. I want to tell a story that I want to hear, and I want you to come to me. There's real value in that. It's like the difference between, Scott calls it Derrickson calls it like the difference between a film and a movie. Like he calls it, a movie goes to you, a film asks you to come to it. And that's obviously a very broad definition, but it makes a lot of sense. And that's how I approached it. I only wanted to make films that challenged people, that made you work a little bit, that created a gap, that you had to cross to kind of find the meaning. It wasn't going to give you every answer. It wasn't going to spoon feed you. And I did that, and I love doing that. And I've done that, and the few people that see those movies tend to like them a lot. But they're just not reaching the kind of people that I hoped to reach. And so then I sort of stumbled my way into adapting this Stephen King short story that I had read as a kid, and I really loved it. It's called The Breathing Method, and I was looking for a way to break into something bigger. I wanted to write bigger movies. I wanted to feed my family, quite frankly. I wanted to find a way to make this career sustainable, because making That Evening Sun over and over again, or The Quarry, wasn't going to pay my bills. I wanted an opportunity to make money while then pursuing those smaller films on the side. And then someone told me that Stephen King will option a story to you for $1 to young filmmakers if he likes you and believes you can do something. And so I pursued that end, and I ended up optioning this short story from King. And then I wrote a script, which he has full script approval of, and he approved the script. And then I gave it to Scott to kind of get his thoughts on it, because I had never written a horror script before. And I gave it to him, and he read it, and he called me the next day, and he said, "Who's directing this?" And I said, "I don't know yet." He goes, "I want to direct it." And I went to see him in the editing room, and he was editing Sinister. He just finished shooting Sinister. And we talked, and he gave me his vision for it, and then we took it to Jason Blum, and who I had never met. And Blum read it and loved it, and we, as a team, went out and sold the movie. It didn't get made, but not yet, at least. But that is how I met Jason Blum, and it really was the project that opened me up to the potential of horror, and also made me realize how much I really loved it, and how I had not been looking at these movies that I loved all these years with the real, not been giving them the sort of their due, and not realizing how powerful they had affected me, and not really considering what I could do in that genre. A lot of horror is really cheap and surfacey and built on just on scares and jump scares. But I think the power of that project that I wrote was that I just wrote a drama. Which means all that I mean by that is that I just approached it from a place of character, and created and did it the same way I'd write anything else, which is writing people that I cared about and putting them in vulnerable positions. And what I realized then is that's really the key, I think, to making a scary movie is vulnerability. And that's both vulnerability for the characters, putting them in vulnerable positions, either physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, but finding the vulnerability of those characters and exploiting that vulnerability. But there's also the vulnerability of the audience, and making the audience feel unsure or unsteady by not knowing what's going to happen or why something's happening. It's the unanswered question that looms over a thing. You can create a pall that's sort of cast over a story. It's leading to some place that you don't know, and that's scary because you don't know. The unknown, it's mystery, right? It's the fear of mystery. As a person of faith, I embrace the power of mystery, but mystery also comes with fear, and I think that, I mean, we can see all the examples of when that fear is rejected or pushed against, and how that then creates a different kind of faith or religion, or I suppose. But when I look at the scariest movies I've ever seen, and I would say that those movies, I'd say the three scariest movies that, for me personally, the scariest film I've ever seen is still Alien. That's a character in a very vulnerable position, right? And there's a thing that can kill you that's on this ship. It's a slasher film, and essentially in a lot of ways, and because this alien takes out people one by one. But it's about the brooding sense of dread. The common denominator for all these films that I find scary really are, they're very slow burn films. I'd say that another scary film that I love deeply is this film called The Vanishing, which is the original Vanishing, the 1988 Austrian film by George Schlauser, I believe is how you say his name, and which is this incredible film, which is just a drama for the 99% of it, until the scariest ending in the history of movies. But it's a brooding, slow burn thing that's hanging over you, this mystery. And The Vanishing is as simple as set up in history. It's like a guy and a girl on a road trip, and they stop for gas, and she goes into the gas station to buy a Coke, and she doesn't come out. And he looks and looks and looks, and she's gone. And a year later, or however long it is, he's still looking. He's obsessed. His life has, been torn apart. And a guy calls him up and says, "I know what happened to your wife, and I'll tell you. All you gotta do is do what I say." And it's that basic idea. If you do what I say, you will know everything. I read someone in the Image Journal years ago wrote that The Vanishing is the greatest film ever made about original sin. It's like the idea of if I could just know, I'll do anything to know. And can you resist not knowing? And I won't spoil the end of that movie for anyone who hasn't seen it, but you should see it. And it's terrifying, utterly terrifying to my core.
And this is the original, not
The original.
Okay.
The remake is not a good movie, although I've seen it been reclaimed recently. And Bill Simmons loves The Vanishing, and they just did a rewatchables on it, and I was like, oh, the remake. And I'm fascinated by that because I think it's a terrible film. I think everything good about the original they ruin. And but it's the power of that premise, which I think is universal. It's very specific to the action, but it's incredibly universal. And if you can ask a question in a movie, what would you do? And anyone who watches that movie can be impacted by that question, because all it is what would you do if someone you love disappeared and you had no idea what happened to them? Anyone in the world can relate to that. That's a powerful premise. That is a great story idea. But it's just a slow burn drama about people, and the dread that hangs over that whole movie is suffocating in the best possible way. But I love that. That sounds like masochistic. I love like that. I love the dread. I love just suffocating dread over a movie.
So you have Alien, Vanishing. What did you have a third one that you're?
The third scariest movie is a movie from 1990 called Jacob's Ladder, directed by Adrian Lyne, and which is very different. It's a much more active film, but it's a nightmare. And Jacob's Ladder is a nightmare of a man's descent into hell, basically. And but it's just full of the most nightmare-inducing, literally, I've had nightmares about that film. Nightmare-inducing imagery. It's some of the most provocative, incredible, terrifying imagery I've ever seen in a movie. And vulnerability there is a character's mental and emotional and spiritual vulnerability. He's a Vietnam vet, and the movie takes place a few years after Vietnam, and he's living in New York City, and he's having all these flashbacks, and he's seeing visions and nightmares, and it seems like PTSD from the war, or something's happening. He's having some spiritual crisis, and what is actually happening is the great mystery of the movie. And so again, you know you're headed towards some end. I know I'm going somewhere. To me, the best movies live inside of one of those premises that set up an ending that you know you're headed toward. So That Evening Sun, my first film, for example, is built upon a similar kind of premise. So an old man is living in a nursing home and doesn't want to live there anymore. So he walks out one day and gets a ride back to his farm in the middle of Tennessee, gets to the farm and discovers someone's living there. His son has sold the farm to this man who the old man considers, not worthy of the property. And so the old man moves on to a little shack on the property and says, I'm not leaving until I get my farm back. And that sets up this confrontation, this showdown between these two men, each claiming the land as their own. And so we're headed towards some kind of final showdown. There's going to be some kind of last big boom. They're going to fight this out and figure out, and someone's going to come out victorious with that land and someone's not. We know we're headed somewhere specific. And what that does is create tension inside of these parameters that we've set up now. And every scene then is loaded with the knowledge that we're headed toward an end. We're headed toward a violent end, most likely. And that creates tension that presses in on the movie from the outside. What that does is allows me as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, not to have to manufacture tension inside of each scene artificially. I mean, I don't have to find the rock rolling down the hill that's running after you inside of each scene, because that rock is the looming threat of this confrontation that's coming down. And that's what I love to do, is just the slow burn, right? The slow burn. And all those movies have that similar kind of thing. We're headed toward, The Vanishing is like, what happened? We're going to find out what happened. And we're just waiting on that. And Alien, we're going to find out. One person's going to be left in Alien. We're going to find out if she lives or dies. And Jacob's Ladder, we're going to find out what's the true cause of all these nightmares and what's really happening here. And we sort of set up, so the beginning sort of sets up the ending in a way that I find creates a tension inside of that space. And that's what I love in a movie, and that's what I love in storytelling.
That's, I think, tell me if this is different than, so is it Robert McKee, the story guy?
Mm-hmm.
my sense or my memory of his suggestion is you're creating and resolving tension at every level of the story, from act to scene to segment and you're kind of saying the opposite, maybe, or in that here's the tension, a slow burn. You're not having to sort of justify that tension in every shot or every segment. It comes with the
Sure, but yes, yeah. I mean, I don't look at it that I don't. So I read that book and I read all those books, and I think the best kind of like people that said they never read those books and they don't need to, like, because they don't need a formula, like, well, it usually comes out in their work. And also people that live and die by those books, that also comes out in their work. What I try to do is just read all those things in film school, internalize them, and then sort of like, and then I move on. And you try to like just, that's a thing I can fall back on if I'm stuck. But like walking through everything mathematically and saying, is this scene resolving? And I don't do that. But hopefully it's just inborn and ingrained in what I do just automatically. Some would probably argue with that if they watch what I do. But like when that, I'm saying like with every scene, because I know I'm going toward an end, that scene's going to push me a little closer to that end. It can't just be a random scene. But if it's pushing me a little bit closer toward that end, then I'm just saying like the scene itself is already built with attention because the characters are carrying the weight of that conflict. There's a central conflict or a hook that's sort of like they carry the burden of that hook into every scene. And it's never leaving them. They're thinking about it all the time. That's a simplicity of premise as opposed to like something that deals more with a story about bureaucracy or a story with multi-characters. Like that's why I don't write
the first
stories.
Mission Impossible. I still go back. I'm like, wait.
I mean, that stuff is like its own high wire act. That's incredible, and I love those kind of movies. But for entertainment purposes, but I don't typically. I'm not drawn to movies about military or government or whatever the bureaucracy or institution might be, because I tend to be drawn to smaller films, smaller characters, number of characters, and a simpler idea that I can sort of flesh out.
So I have it. One thing I'd be interested to know, so let's talk a little bit about your specific projects. And a lot of them, like your the treatment you did of the Stephen King novel, Halloween, Insidious, The Exorcist. So you're dealing with pre-existing material. Mm-hmm. How do you, and some of these are like near iconic. Mm-hmm. So what goes through your mind so that you're not overly intimidated by that? In terms of how you then kind of do a yes and to the stuff you're handed?
It's a good question. I mean, I think with those films, so my work in the horror genre has been an interesting sort of deviation from what I thought my career path would be. It's an exciting deviation that I enjoy, but ultimately, to this point, I'm not directing these movies, and I'm there to serve. I kind of say in a little bit of a way, like that's my craft. And I have my art, which are the films that I develop myself to direct. Because ultimately, as a writer, as only a writer, not to diminish it, but only a writer, you're not the last step in the process. You don't have the final say in the thing, in film. In television, you can. But in film, you don't. You hand that over to a director and a team who go make this movie. And ultimately, it's the director's vision in a film that comes to fruition. So in order not to become a person who's angry and bitter and heartbroken and upset about all the changes that will be made, and they are legion, I approached it and have approached it and still approach it as simply, I'm here to serve. I'm like a midwife. This is a property, we're trying to take this pre-existing property toward a movie, create a movie, and you have a vision for it. You might have a vision for it. Sometimes I come onto these properties and there's already a director, like Halloween and The Exorcist and Insidious, all had a director already. So when I began those journeys, I'm there like meeting with the director from day one saying, what is your vision for this? How can I serve you? I'm going to bring myself to that project. That's one of the reasons that they want me there, I think. I'm going to bring myself to that project, but I have no illusions that my vision for this thing will be what makes it to the screen. Because so far it hasn't been until really The Exorcist, which is I will say, of all those movies, is the closest to what that original vision was. But along the way, what happens in the Hollywood machine is that it doesn't just squeeze out, and it's not anyone's fault. It's like the nature of the beast, really. Like I write scripts that I'd call like Shaggy Dog scripts, meaning I have a lot of little tangents and little character beats and little things that don't always push the story forward, but they create character, meaning like give the script character, give the story character, give it something memorable, give it something colorful. And I think that's what people are drawn to my writing, why they're drawn to my writing, and I think that's why I'm employed, for one of the reasons. But what happens is, the irony being that, so I write these scripts that have all these little rough edges. But when a movie goes through the Hollywood machine, all those rough edges tend to get sanded off. They get squeezed out because there's time, there's money. So, for example, in Firestarter, because of financial constraints on the project, which financial restraints translate to time restraints, or constraints. So we need this many days to shoot the movie. Well, the budget will only dictate this many days. So I lose X number of days on the budget, which means I have to lose X number of pages from the script. So if you have a script that's 115 pages, as that one was, and you have to make that script 100 pages, that's 15 pages, or, like a solid, more than 10% of your movie. Think about that for a second, which has to come out in pre-production, which is what happened on that project. And that's nobody's fault except just the numbers of that's the studio game. And so what happens, of course, is what do you need? Do you need the scene that says the information, the exposition? And do you need the scene where the kid and the father have this moment of a small moment together, which may not progress the story, but builds and deepens their relationship? Well, they're going to say, well, you don't need that. You need this. You got to have the exposition. You got to tell the story. And so what tends to happen is those small little moments get cut or pushed away or sanded off. And what you end up with is a movie that only has exposition and is missing all the flavor, all the color. And so as I look at it, like, I kind of know now, I've learned the hard way that all those little tangents, all that Shaggy Dog stuff is going to probably come off. So I approach things a little differently now, but all that's to say, like, I'm not precious with that anymore, like, because it's going to change. I'm just trying, that's sort of big budget horror right now. That's big budget filmmaking in general. The most interesting films have always, and will always be made on a smaller independent level. Like Barbarian, for example. Okay, Barbarian never would have survived a studio process because if it had been developed inside of a studio, it's just too many zigs and zags. That movie, love it or hate it, that movie does some bold, risky things structurally that I think only happened because it was allowed to be created. Written on spec.
As in restart halfway through.
Sure.
New movie. Wait, what?
Which is a bold and brilliant idea that that happened, I believe, because he wrote it in his garage and not with no expectation of anyone's notes or whatever. And it came to life fully formed as a script, as opposed to going through the development process, which tends to sand things down at a studio level. And once you let go of that, I took a lot of lumps. I took things very personally, like when those movies are released and people crap on them online, or critics, because I'm very proud of a lot of those scripts. And it's just the process just squeezes out some of the life sometimes. And then when it comes to dealing with the pressure of iconic material, because ultimately the buck doesn't stop with me, it frees me up to take some risks. The Stephen King story I adapted that kind of got me into the world of horror is radically different than, my script is radically different than the story it's based upon. my version of Firestarter was radically different than the book, to many people's chagrin. But the 1984 adaptation was literally the book. It was almost a beat by beat retelling of the book. My thought was then, well, they've already done that. That actually frees me up to try something different. You might not like it, but I don't see the point in just doing the book again when it's already been done once, theatrically, cinematically. And so I wanted to take a risk, and sometimes it doesn't pay off. I love that script, and I poured a lot of myself into it, and that's the stuff that kept saying it out. And you live and you learn, and you move on to the next one, and you protect stuff differently and better next time. But I actually think, because I know it's going to go through a process, and the director has the ultimate call at the end of the day, it frees me up to be a little more risky.
So I have this theory. It's not really a theory, but about the Halloween universe. Okay, so you have John Carpenter's. All right, there, it's canon. Everyone would recognize that. And then you have all this stuff. There's a woman that I know that was on the podcast, and she worked for Rob Zombie in one of the Halloweens he did. And she said something about how in the one I think he just did one. He's like building out backstory for Mike Myers, right? And in terms of like psychological stuff, blah, blah, blah. And then I think I see Jamie Lee Curtis talk about the reboot that starts not with yours. Yours is the second in the reboot, right? What was the first one called? Just Halloween. Okay. And importantly, saying no, the connection between Laurie Strode and Mike Myers there is none. Right. It's important that he has essentially no character. He is just the sort of random act of violence coming to get you because you're in the way, essentially. Yeah. So if your thing is character, building out character, and now you're writing, maybe how do you think about him as a character? Because I'm thinking what's so terrifying about that movie is it really is like tapping into our fear of random violence, that there is no explanation. There is nothing bigger plan. It's just he's there, he's going to stab you to death.
Yeah, I mean, it's that unknown, right? He is unknowable. And it's that fear of someone who's unknowable that is really destabilizing, I think. What I loved about writing Halloween, and I've spoken at events, Christian events, and people literally stood up and like, how can you, as someone who claims to be a Christian, how can you write Halloween? One reason I loved writing Halloween is because, again, it's that idea of dealing with the idea of evil. And as a person of faith, I think that really compels me. And what compels me is the unanswerability of it, because that is the nature of faith. And that is the nature of evil. It's like unknowable. It is not a person. I don't believe a person is evil. And that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to deal with. But as a person of faith writing a thing like that, when I tell people, and I tell people who confront me about that, if I give you two premises or two themes of a movie and ask you which one was more appropriate for a Christian to write, if I said a film that says evil is a real thing in this world and cannot be defeated by man alone, or I told you that might makes right was the theme, which one's the more appropriate for a Christian to write? You say, well, evil is a real thing in this world that cannot be defeated by man alone. Well, that's Halloween. And might makes right is 90% of action movies, superhero movies, and usually that might is made right through violence, okay? But if I told you just like out of the gate, which is more appropriate for a Christian to write, Halloween or the Avengers, you say, well, the Avengers, the good guys always win. Well, how do they win? They usually kill someone or explode some demon or bad guy. Not to put that movie especially, but as a symbol for
the MCU, we'll just
as a symbol for action movies and writ large superhero movies. Now we can argue about the ways in which that is presented in Halloween Kills, and the extremity of the violence, for example. And And we can argue about that. And I'll hear your arguments because I understand them. And again, like, I can write a thing and ultimately someone else makes it, and I'm not in charge of that. Not to put off responsibility, but just to say it's not just one person's vision, no matter what it is. But I will say that without question, that's what that film is about. And that's what I wish people would be able to embrace more and not be afraid of that. The unknowability of evil and how that plays out in the world. And the best horror, that's what Alien is. So the alien in Alien is like Michael Myers. Unknowable. You don't know why they're doing what they are doing. And that's, if you had a reason, give me a reason. It's simpler, easier to digest. Because it's retribution. Like, you killed my girlfriend, so I'm going to kill you. Whatever it is. But the unknowability of evil, it's really hard. That's why I love Alien. That's why I love The Vanishing. It is absolutely chilling to its core because you believe that could happen. And I'm sure it probably has happened to in some other degree. Seeing that it challenges my faith, which is what I want from my art. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. I meet and encounter and see so many people of faith who live in fear. And that's just the opposite of living the story of Jesus, in my opinion. And I think that's why I love wrestling with that through horror, because I have to confront the unknowable. It deepens me as a human being, gives me more compassion, and it makes me have to continue to dig deeper so that my faith isn't simple and therefore not solid and not real, ultimately, and easy to wipe away, and easy to be given to fear. And so when your political party doesn't win, when your job is unstable, when the market crashes, when there's a school shooting, when stuff happens in the world that makes you afraid, if your faith is weak, so your fear will be amplified. And I would argue that horror movies deepen your faith by making you confront your fear. The best of them do. Those that really dig in, ones I'm talking about. And I would also add to that list The Silence of the Lambs and The Shining and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Seven. I would add these movies to things that make you confront the darkest realities of humankind, and that deepens my faith, and I think it would deepen others too, and because we have to really be afraid and confront that fear.
Tell me what you think about this. So in doing this podcast, I've been thinking, what I first had in mind, because probably this will be a largely Christian-ish audience in some way. I mean, they might be sort of post-Christian, whatever, but at least aware of that tradition. And I've been going through part of what the value of horror is that it helps us deal directly with fear so that we can kind of overcome it, right, and get rid of it or whatever. And because this is the perfect love casts out fear, right? Like we want to eliminate fear. Then later I was like, well, actually, the more you and others have talked along these lines, I'm like, there's also all these biblical texts of, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? Like that. Wait a minute, maybe as you're getting at, a sort of discipling of our fear happens in these contexts that doesn't happen when it's the actual mass shooting or the whatever that we're dealing with. And what we're actually learning to do in horror genre, it doesn't have to just be film, but in general, is we're allowing our fears to be rightly directed, as opposed to eliminating fear from our life, going here's how I direct my fear rightly, as opposed to have it being misdirected or leveraged by somebody else.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Okay, good. That's what I'm thinking right now. That tracks with kind of where you're going.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that. Having a healthy outlet for that fear and a way to process it. And you wouldn't think that the way to be less afraid is to be more afraid, or to put yourself in positions where you can be more afraid. But again, it's the safe confines of the dramatic storytelling experience where you get to experience these emotions vicariously. It's a safe place. Watching a movie is a safe place to experience fear, and you survive it, and you live through it, and you understand it, and you empathize and sympathize more with people who experience it. And hopefully that allows you then to see other people with more compassion. And again, to know that evil might be a real thing in the world, but it doesn't mean that person is evil. As my wife so eloquently says, no one's a bitch for no reason. And that goes broadly to how we view people, and through the lens of the cinematic experience, the movie-going experience, just creates an opportunity to learn how to love and deepen our emotions.
You know, it makes me think we were just on a trip with my kids, 12, 10, and 7, all girls. Mm-hmm. And we were in this area, it's a city area, and a woman that was clearly had some mental health issues, sort of walking, you can hear her screaming, sort of shouting random profanities as she's walking down, everyone's sort of like kind of avoiding and walking down, and our kids are there, and so you go, okay, well, you assess the situation, and it's like, okay, there's not any real danger, but to them, you can tell they're kind of like, what's happening, Mom and Dad? Like, they're uneasy, they're a little scared. It was interesting in that real world moment. We crossed over the street as we were going, and they're kind of looking like, what's happening? What's wrong with her? And we took it as this interesting moment, sort of like the parenting teaching moment, to go, hey, I know that's a little scary, but just so you know, she's obviously dealing with something that, and we started talking about like society, and isn't it sad that there's no one, her family's not here to help, and we don't know her, and we're unsure about it, but don't worry, blah, blah, blah. So it was really our attempt to go like, let's address your fears. I'm not going to say you shouldn't be afraid, kids. That is scary. Sure. Now let's think about how this is a human being who's not like the origin and source of all the, the terror in the world. And I did that there, and same thing with the movie, but then also it's interesting in, let's say, in Christian contexts where that person is, we like sort of scapegoat them. Like that person is actually the thing to be afraid of, totally. And the great evil, totally. And so they need to be avoided, rejected, feared, etc. Totally. And I hadn't thought about that until just as you're talking.
And that is like René Girard, the French philosopher, wrote some incredible stuff on mimetic desire and the scapegoating system, and how Jesus broke everything by turning that whole idea on its head, and the way that people for thousands and thousands of years prior to that had dealt with evil, was purging it through a person. And so it's wonderful stuff, but that simple task that you a simple idea that you share with your children is the key to humanity. And that is good. And if we can do that, like if we can see that every person has, another way that is similar to my wife says, but my friend Gareth Higgins says, like, there's for everyone in the world who you meet, your entire opinion could be changed about them if you knew one additional fact about their life. And 'cause everyone's got a story, right? And because maybe it's like this here's this person who's yelling and screaming and seems like a threat to me, and what you don't know about what just happened, or what happened 6 months ago, or the service she didn't get, or the services she didn't get, or the meds she lost, or whatever might be the situation. Then you have, and if you just look at her as like a screaming person who is to be avoided, that's how we got into the mess that we're in now.
I think that's been my thing, because I was not a big horror fan coming into this. And actually, I think it was Kenneth that convinced me, and Scott Derrickson too, going like, all right, I'll give it a chance. I always just thought I was kind of a weenie when it comes to horror. But since we're like, all right, we're going to do a whole season on this, I'm like, all right, part of it, I'm going to do a deep dive, and also kind of go like, why do some of these stories stay with me in the way they do? And so a lot of it is that sort of self-understanding and acceptance that there are real fears, there are real vulnerabilities that I don't like to acknowledge, I think is a big part of it. And most of these movies force me to go, okay, you really are on a spaceship, and the great evil is going to come, and no one's coming to help you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's terrifying. Like, you need to reckon with that. So it's been a pretty interesting journey so far. And I think what I hadn't thought about till today, you're talking on the community side of, it also helps to know that other people feel that same way.
Yeah.
Like, you go, oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not weak or incapable. I'm human in that sense.
Yeah, man. And like, and you can tell another thing about the films that I'm talking about. I think that it's like, I see that empathy in the filmmaker's approach to the story, how they render character. I don't think their aim is simply to shock me. And you see that horror. There's a lot of horror, cheap horror that's just there to shock. And it's like, and like movies that are just gore fests. Like, I think those movies, there's a surface level response to that you have, and that's as far as it goes. But I think these movies I've mentioned are deeper things that search towards something like a spiritual or emotional or mental capacity to this that really elevates them.
So, speaking of spiritual, and the fact that you said you feel like the final product of The Exorcist is pretty close to what you wanted or saw. As you think about, since that's not Halloween, which is a very, like, a person,
Sure.
There's not any supernatural element to it. Exorcist, a lot of people say it's scary because of the supernatural. You get some supernatural horror that's different. And sometimes I'm like, I think it's just different in terms of our different vulnerabilities. But maybe I'm off on that. So if you're going to say what either the original or the one that now you've come out with is what really makes that movie terrifying, is it because it goes into, there's a whole nother reality out there that we often don't acknowledge? Or is it tapping into some of those same just fears of the unknowable, or that sort of hovering pallor? What'd you call it? Not the unexpected. Was it the unknown or the mystery?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a bit of both. I don't know how you think about that with The Exorcist in particular.
Any successful film that deals with spiritual realm, demons, etc. The success of that film is that it deals with it in a way that's not laughable or cheesy. And at some point, you can really only chalk that up to just masterful filmmaking. I really can't. It's hard to even articulate, because 100 filmmakers can, like, show me a girl's head spinning around and the bed and jumping up and, like, being tossed around on a bed, and that would be silly. And somehow what he did was terrifying. So at some point, it's just masterful filmmaking that makes that feel real, makes something that a lot of people don't believe is real feel very real. Part of its power is that it renders itself through a child. I think that anyone who's ever known a child or had a sibling, a younger sibling, or was a child, but especially for parents or people who have relationships with children, to see a child rendered unknowable to you. And I've seen it, like in kids. I know kids who have severe anxiety. I know kids who deal with mental health issues. It can be often similar, just in terms of the unknowability of a child. I don't know who this is. A child can feel possessed sometimes. And there's nothing more terrifying than I felt as an adult with children in my life that I love, myself and my own and others, when they are gripped by something that makes them act in ways that are in conflict with I know who they are as people. And I have no answers, and my solutions don't fix it. And the counseling doesn't fix it, and the medication doesn't fix it. And all the unconditional love in the world doesn't fix it. That's terrifying. And I've experienced that. And I think part of that power of that story is it's rendered through a child. But I really just think it's the fact that a spiritual entity, when rendered masterfully by a master filmmaker, doesn't play by any earthly rules, isn't boundaried by physics, by gravity. And so when an evil presence is not playing by the same rules that we play, when they have other weapons to employ that we don't have as humans, that's terrifying. I think we probably all experience unexplainable phenomena in our lives. And typically it's benevolent or ambivalent or just whatever, but like when it's malevolent, when this unexplained phenomenon is out to hurt you, I think The Shining would fall into that. Jacob's Ladder would fall into that same group. When that unexplained phenomena seems to have ill intent, and you don't know how far it will go. I think it's a combination of entities that don't play by our rules and rendered through a child, through the vulnerability of a child. That combination, I think, was especially powerful. But again, only when filtered through a master filmmaker's craft, and that's really the difference.
So maybe last question, unless you want to add some extra things. So this is a Craven quote. Horror doesn't generate fear, it releases it. What do you think he means? And do you agree? I guess you could, depending on what you think he means, you could say you agree or not.
I like that. That's interesting. Who's that?
Wes Craven.
Oh, Wes Craven.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Horror doesn't generate fear, it releases it. That's cool, man. I like that idea. Well, what I like about it is it makes me think what it means. And I don't really know what it means. I mean, I think it can mean a couple of things. It's a very interpretive quote, or a quote that's open to interpretation. But there is, I mean, I would say one way I could interpret that I like, one useful interpretation would be that this idea of mystery and the unknown and the spiritual realm is all around us. And we don't have to like generate it up. In the same way, we don't have to invite God into our presence. God is all around us, I believe, all the time. And this is all, and that mystery, that unknown, those things that can scare us, that unknown, which we can often be afraid of, and is all around us. And we may not see it. What horror does is maybe channels it and gives it an outlet to be seen and recognized. That's one way I would sort of interpret that, as opposed to generating it. It doesn't have to like create something scary out of thin air, because so much of our existence is unknowable. The biggest questions we'll ever ask, we'll never know. And that in itself can be terrifying. And I think horror channels that through story, through metaphor, and releases it out onto the world in a way that makes you see it anew, perhaps. Makes you see it fresh. It makes it tangible.